if we assess the situation on the front line, we can say that situation didn't change that great from the previous time we recorded the podcast. Basically, the front line of Russian-Ukrainian war, all-out war, is still divided in two parts, two halves. On the one hand, in the south, in Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, front line is mostly static one, so all the battles that are taking place there are of local character. Both sides are just trying to improve their tactical position, and there are no major changes. So neither Russia nor Ukraine has the preponderance of power to try to change the situation radically in its favor. Operationally and strategically. But despite this fact, we can say that locally in Kherson region, Ukraine was able to mount some local counterattacks, despite the fact that in the east of Ukraine we are on defensive mode. So in Kherson region, there were at least two instances where Ukraine successfully pushed Russian forces from the positions they previously controlled. So the first instance took place around the settlement Davydiv Brid. Davydiv Brid is located on the left bank of Ingulets River, and also Davydiv Brid is a very important one because it sits on the very important ground line of communications that is leading from Kherson to northern part of the Kherson region, where the Russian grouping of forces might potentially threaten not only Kryvyi Rih, but also Zaporizhia and Dnipro from the rear. If Russia has a preponderance of manpower, has the ability to concentrate the manpower to move from this position in the northern part of the Kherson region. And with Ukraine threatening this northern part of the Kherson region, Russia's positions there through attack on the ground lines of communication is a very good instance where when Ukraine, despite the fact that we are majorly preoccupied with the fighting in the east, specifically about Severodonetsk, but despite this preoccupation, we're still able to mount some local counter attacks that can radically change the situation on the Ukrainian favor. And also we have some reports from settlement to the west of Kherson specifically, because some settlements at the distance of approximately 30-35 kilometers, some settlements were liberated by the Ukrainian troops. I suppose that Ukrainian troops use these assault tactics that we honed in counterattacks around the Kharkiv. So we utilized the high density of small settlements, and with assault tactics we took control of some settlements and create some flanking and flank threat to other Russian positions and made them to withdraw to shorten their front lines. So there are some also local successes, not only at Davydiv Brid, but also at the distance of 30-35 kilometers to the Kherson city. But in general, as I said, operationally, strategically, the situation in the south of Ukraine, in Kherson, in Zaporizhia region, is more or less the same one. So if you look at the maps and compare the situations that was a month ago and now, basically one can see that front line is static one and all battles are local, and both sides are just trying to improve their tactical position, tactical situation. And alas, we also have reports from the General Staff of Ukraine that Russians are trying to fortify their position, so they are creating the belts of defensive positions that would make it harder for Ukraine to implement possible counteroffensive to liberate the south of Ukraine that was occupied in the first stage of this all-out war. Situation around Kharkiv more or less stabilized after Ukrainian successful counterattacks in the first half of May, and now the situation is the same as it is in South Ukraine. So all the fighting is positional. all the fighting is of local nature, just tactical improvements of the position attempted by both sides. And now we have signs that Russians are trying to replay the results of Ukrainian successful counterattacks. They try to mount their own counterattack to the northeast of Kharkiv, but so far, despite some reports about activization of Russian activities, some of the attempts to pierce Ukrainian defense, there is no success. So just some local fightings, despite some intensification of fighting to the northeast of Kharkiv. But on the other hand, we have the part of the front lines that that at the place of the most active fighting. It's from the Izum salient, Russia controlled from Izum salient, then along to the Siversky Donetsk River, to the Severodonetsk salient, then down to this Bakhmut, Lysychansk ground line of communication, and also down to Avdiivka and outskirts of Donbass itself. So it's the place of most active fighting, and Severodonetsk salient is the place, the venue where Russians are continuously attempting to take control of this city. And there is active debate in professional circles, I mean, among the experts, about the wisdom of Ukraine continuously defending Severodonetsk, despite the threat of encirclement, despite the flank threat to ground lines of communication, this Bakhmut Lysychansk road leading to Severodonetsk. But in my opinion, first of all, nobody should call in question the ability of Ukrainian military leadership to adequately assess the situation, to adequately assess both our forces, both Russian forces, predict the correlation of forces, take into account all the risks, and implement the plans to conduct operation around this salient. Basically, we can say that previous predictions that Severodonetsk salient, its fate is doomed, they proved wrong, because despite the fact that Russians moved from Popasna, and they indeed threatened this ground line of communication from Bakhmut to Lysychansk, but Ukrainian military leadership, they moved in reserves. We stabilized this part of our front line, and that's why, despite the threat, Severodonetsk is still standing. And as for me, the main reason why Severodonetsk is still standing is the logic, the idea of Ukrainian military leadership that we can pin down as much forces as we can, and we can make Russia to concentrate all combat proven, combat ready forces they have on the front lines around Severodonetsk, because Severodonetsk is very important politically for Russian political and military leadership, because taking control of Severodonetsk creates ability for Russian political and military leadership to provide proofs for their population that this so-called special military operation is successful. So the Russians would move any reserves, would move any combat-ready formations they have to Severodonetsk to take control of it, and we would use this fact. We are currently using this, and we would use it further. And knowing that Severodonetsk is number one priority means that we could anticipate, we could predict all possible venues of the attack, and it means that there would be no surprises. And also we can use the urban character of a battlefield to ameliorate the Russian superiority in firepower that is ensured both by tube and rocket artillery, and also by airplanes and attack helicopters. And even under most negative scenario that Ukraine would have to withdraw with fighting First of all, I'm 100% sure that this would be done because this would be done successfully, because Ukraine has quite quite good experience of this withdrawal with fighting that was gained in mid-February 2015 around the Baltsevo salient. And that's the second thing, even if Russians would take control of Severodonetsk, it wouldn't mean that they would be able to turn this local success into something bigger, because first of all, their tactics now it doesn't envision this major attacks, major advancements with armor and infantry, unsupported by artillery, because it is done in the reverse order. First of all, a lot of artillery and aviation, and then only slow movement of armor and infantry. And the second reason why Russia won't be able to turn this possible hypothetical success around Severodonetsk into something big in a bigger story is because they are lacking manpower. Because yes, Russians have ample firepower, but they are constantly feeling this lack of manpower because this secret mobilization, partial mobilization that is done by Russia, and the piecemeal character of the employment of these new forces, it means that Russia is lacking the necessary manpower to turn this successful employment of firepower into something big. So even if we would have to leave Severodonetsk, but again, there is no other reason to do it. But even if we do it, we would do it in order. We would withdraw with fighting, and Russia won't be able to translate this possible hypothetical success into something bigger, because their tactics changed and they are constantly feeling the effects of the lack of manpower in their forces. If we are talking about German government approach toward Russian-Ukrainian war in a realm of material tactical assistance to Ukraine, I would say that German government is a #1 target of Ukrainian criticism, and this criticism is not groundless. It is based on the reality that Germany is the sole Western European country, sole bigger player that has not transited from just provision of the light equipment to the provision of the heavy equipment. So if we even compare the approach of the French government, which is also an ambiguous one, or even Italian government that is also combines both provision of equipment and some ideas about possible peace plans, German approach is very, I would say, very difficult in terms of being able to characterize as a positive, because despite the fact that yes, also France and Italy, not to say about UK or US, they are also talking about diplomacy, but Germany is only talking about diplomacy, is not providing with heavy equipment. Basically, we can say that Germany is the sole bigger European players that still provide Ukraine heavy equipment. So all the Germany provided before, it was about light anti-tank weapons like grenade launchers, anti-tank guided missiles. Also, it's anti-tank mines. Also, it was some manpads, and also some defensive items like bulletproof vests, like medical kits, and so on. So Germany is the only country among bigger players that hasn't transited from light equipment to more heavy equipment. So It is that's why it is a subject of the biggest criticism by Ukrainian expert community, Ukrainian diplomats, including our ambassador Andriy Melnik, who is actively promoting in Germany the case that Ukraine needs heavy equipment. Right here, right now, we can say that there was a number of instances where Germany promised to deliver heavy equipment and it didn't materialize. So right here, right now, we are in anticipation of possible shipment of a number of self-propelled howitzers, Panzerhaubitze 2000, but it is even less than 1 battalion, so it's less than even 12 to 18 pieces. It's just 7 pieces, as far as I remember. It's very little of the amount. Also, Germany promised to deliver air defense system Gepard, but the date of possible delivery is mid-July, and we still have to wait approximately a month, and then also we'll see how this promise would materialize. And also Germany promised to deliver surface-to-air missiles that can cover Ukrainian territory, to provide a cover for the territory. But again, the possible date of the delivery is not even 2022, it's approximately 2023. And the most strange situation with a possible delivery of heavy equipment is about this multiple launch rocket system Germany has. So first, Germany tentatively said that they are able to provide this multiple launch rocket system, the same one basically, their local modifications, their local variant of M270 multiple launch rocket system. But then German government stated that the modification in question they have in Bundeswehr is not able to fire this extended range guided missiles of the range of 70 to 80 kilometers that are promised to Ukraine by both the US and UK. But the stories prove opposite. I mean, there were stories that the same modifications in, for instance, Italy army and other armies, they were able to fire these missiles. So it's very strange case, to put it mildly, to explain German behavior. And also there were instances that basically Germany blocked the idea raised by both such governments as Spain, or also its own producers of heavy equipment, to deliver for Ukraine the armor, both infantry fighting vehicles or even main battle tanks. But Germany, under very bogus arguments that Ukraine might move fighting to the Russian soil, to the Russian territory, under these claims, under these arguments, Germany hesitated, and basically there is no instance, no case, no evidence to say that Germany is ready to provide us with the proper armor, like main battle tanks or infantry fighting vehicles or more personal carriers and so on. So the case of Germany is very difficult if when we are talking about heavy equipment. Germany is the sole bigger player in Europe that hasn't switched from light equipment provision to more heavy equipment. A lot of instances where Germany promised or tentatively broached the possibility of delivering heavy equipment, and then stepped aside, basically made a step backward, so retreated from the previous promises. And also we're going to see, basically, when we receive this 7 self-propelled Panzerhaubitze 2000 pieces, whether it would be indeed in June or if the date would be postponed. The second thing, of course, is this Gepard self-propelled air defense system of close range, and also whether Germany indeed would be able to deliver on its promise to ship these surface-to-air missiles to cover large swaths of Ukrainian territory. But again, the date is very, very late because we need improved air defenses right here, right now. When we are talking about the fighting, we can say that Russian-Ukrainian all-out war is the fight between two artilleries, two forces of tube rocket artillery and missiles. While this is so, because Russia was not able to gain air superiority despite the quantitative advantage of the air platforms. But despite this, it's a kind of miracle, I would say, and also the testament for the deficiency of Russian air forces that they were not able to gain air supremacy. So that the fact that Ukrainian air forces were successful in continuously contesting airspace about Ukraine, and they are doing so even now, it's a kind of miracle, and it is the reason why this war is, first of all, artillery war, because Russia was not able to gain air superiority. And well, in Ukrainian case, these airstrikes, we do it approximately maybe 10, 11 a day. It's just a supplement in our system of fires, because the majority of the destruction is done by artillery. So Russia didn't gain this air superiority. We are not able to satisfy all the needs in terms of the destruction of targets with air power. So Russian-Ukrainian war is the fight of two artilleries. And especially it is a case after Russians changed their tactics, because in first phase of this war, before the end of March, Russians were mostly employing unsupported columns of armor and infantry, and only when they switched their attention and concentrated major on the east of Ukraine, they started to conduct war basically as they were taught, because Russian army's artillery army was also with armor, but it's artillery army as they are continuing tradition of the Soviet armies. That was also artillery army, given the disproportionate share of artillery compared to the other component of the armed forces. And yes, Russians, they changed their tactics. They basically started employing superior firepower, combining these UAVs like Orlan 10, like Elron, like Granat, and others to create these Recon Strike, Recon Fire complexes. And they start to obliterate basically Ukrainian cities, to turn them into rumble, and only then move infantry. It was the case with Rubizhne, that is the outskirt of Severodonetsk. It was also the case with Popasnas, that is obliterated almost fully. We can see it from the satellite images. And as a result, we can see that Russians are moving only slowly, because, as I said previously, they are feeling the lack of manpower. But it's a kind of just creeping advances. And that's why Ukraine is pleading the West, that why Ukraine is continuously asking for the firepower, because, well, it's as simple that you can counter enemy firepower with your own firepower. And we use the potential, we use the capabilities of the Ukrainian firepower, but there are limits, because we're using Soviet heritage system whose lifespan is very long one, and there are a lot of wariness. This system are worn out, and also there is a case of ammunition, because we don't produce ammunition, and even the stocks of the ammunition for artillery, for tube and rocket artillery in Central and Eastern Europe isn't indefinite. That's why Ukraine basically from the mid of March, so it was still fighting around Kyiv, but Ukrainian government, Ukrainian diplomats, politicians, also our servicemen, Commander-in-Chief of Armed Forces, Valery Zaluzhny, all of them were starting to make case for artillery. Because as I said, you can't counter the enemy firepower with anything else except with your own firepower. We made some progress, because US, Australia, Canada Also Italy, France, Poland, they delivered, and also Norway, they delivered to us in total approximately, I would say, maybe 150, 160 pieces of NATO caliber artillery, tube artillery, but it's definitely not enough. According to advisor to the head of the office of the president, Ukraine need at least 1,000 pieces of tube artillery of 155 caliber, millimeter caliber. And also, it's not about tube artillery, because the problem with all this tube artillery of 155 millimeters caliber is that they can strike only in a tactical depth of enemy defense. So it's approximately 20 to 25 kilometers. So to have a really effective defense, we need longer range firepower. That's why Ukrainian president from the mid of April was making the case specifically about ISA M142 or M270 multiple launch rocket system. And this is precisely the system we need, because we need the firepower with a range of 70 to 80 kilometers to be able to strike Russian command and control nodes, to strike logistics, and also to strike any reinforcements that might come to support original assaults. So we want to interdict Russian reinforcement before they come to the front line. And with this, we want to repeat the precepts of airland battle doctrine that was created in the context of the USSR threat to the NATO in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when NATO was also inferior in terms of number of troops and armor, but relying on firepower and relying on the possibility to strike in depth. It meant in theory that you can destroy enemy before it create the preponderance of forces at this or that part of the front line, and pierce your defense, create the hole, and then exploit this this breakthrough and turn it from the tactical one to operational and strategic one. So it's not only about tube artillery of 155 millimeter caliber with the range of maybe 30 kilometers, maybe 35 kilometers, but it is only about being able to strike in a tactical zone of defense. We also need to be able to strike in further, to interdict reinforcement, to fight with logistics, with C2 nodes, and only with this we can guarantee that front line would be stabilized, that Russian advances would be arrested, and Ukraine would save as much lives as possible. So firepower ensured by tube rocket artillery, and also in best scenario also operational tactical missiles is our #1 priority. And we already made the case, and we will continue to make the case, because enough firepower, enough artillery is never enough, and you can counter only with the proper firepower, the Russian firepower that is employed, and that is not as effective on its own without armor and infantry with proper amount, but still it allows Russia to make these creeping advances, as we saw around Severodonetsk, around Popasna, to the north of the Siversky Donetsk River. So only Western supplied firepower can counter Russian firepower.